States and our allies and partners continue to face serious foreign challenges that will test us for decades to come. China, under the rule of the Chinese Communist Party, is our chief competitor. Russia, too, remains a key adversary. The efforts of these two nations to sow discord, wreak havoc, and undo the free and open international order upon which shared prosperity and security are built have reached new heights. They have stepped up disinformation and manipulated international institutions, suppressed the voices of freedom and democracy, propped up heinous dictators, coerced and invaded their neighbors, and denied millions of people access to life-saving humanitarian assistance. We have a long road ahead of us in this new era of great power competition. We need sustained political will. These challenges require nothing less. On top of all of this, we are confronted by a new and acute challenge, a biological enemy that we still do not fully understand, an enemy that in 6 short months has inflicted levels of physical and economic harm upon the world that we have not seen in more than 100 years. Here again, China especially, but also Russia, has played a destructive role, from withholding vital global health data to spreading disinformation and actively stealing vaccine research. China and Russia have again chosen to be and proven themselves to be adversaries. Sanctioning bad actors will never be enough. To confront these and other challenges, the Department will need to rely upon a vast array of tools and resources. Our diplomats must be backed by effective and efficient assistance so they can help partners help themselves and contribute to the growth of healthier, more stable societies. We are eager to support a budget that will advance these critical interests and support the State Department's most critical resources, its people. As the coronavirus emerged from China and accelerated across the globe, you were forced to pull back thousands of our diplomats and their families. But you didn't just pack up and go without a thought of your fellow Americans. Instead, the department launched an unprecedented mission to help return more than 100,000 Americans safely home. All of us who participated in that are greatly appreciative of the department's work in that regard. In some cases, this involved convincing countries to reopen their airspace for flights and roads for transport. In other places, you even chartered planes to get our American people home. There are lots of folks who may never come in contact with the department, yet now more than 100,000 Americans who can personally attest to the tremendous work that the department does for our people every day. As the challenges get more numerous and complex, we want to support a State Department that is up to the task, fully funded, staffed, and equipped to advance U.S. national interests on all fronts and at all times. We obviously have threats that impede this, be it health or security, but as the saying goes, all politics are local. Our adversaries understand this all too well. We need our diplomats to be local too. On a personal note, in closing, let me say I want to publicly thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your accessibility that you've had as Secretary. As you know, in operating this committee, it's essential that I have instant access to facts and information, and at times when I haven't been able to get that through the usual intelligence channels, you've always made yourself instantly accessible, and I sincerely appreciate that. When I'm asked for advice from other second branch entities or individuals or even allies of ours, it is absolutely imperative that I have this information. You have always provided that, and when you answer the phone, sometimes I never know where you are on the globe or what time it is, but you've always made it happen. And for that, I have been and remain very grateful. With that, Senator Menendez.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for joining us this morning, Mr. Secretary. It's been a while since you have joined us, and I appreciate your enthusiasm for fulfilling this part of your constitutional responsibilities. But if past is precedent, I don't imagine we're going to see you here anytime soon. So while this is your opportunity to defend your stunningly ill-conceived request to slash the budget of our foreign policy instruments, I'd also like to take a wholesale look at how your department has represented the American people and American interests on the world stage over the past year, And unfortunately, that view is not good, to say the least. Under your watch, the United States has faced setback after setback on the world stage, ceding leverage and influence to our stated adversaries. Today, Iran is much closer to a nuclear bomb than when you came into office, and despite your maximum pressure campaign, Iran and its proxies continue to create problems throughout the Middle East. While the 2017 National Security Strategy details that, quote, Russia wants to weaken U.S. influence in the world and divide us from our allies and partners and undermine the legitimacy of democracies, close quote, the President and your administration has at best not seriously addressed this threat. You have never fully used the tools we provided in CATSA, and at worst, simply abetted Putin's efforts. Withdrawing forces from Germany, failing to take action when evidence emerged that Russia was paying bounties to kill U.S. troops in Afghanistan, and twice redirecting funds from the European Deterrence Initiative to pay for President Trump's wasteful border wall in September of 2019 and April 2020. Meanwhile, the administration's confrontational bluster against China has not stopped China's march in the South China Sea, in Hong Kong, in suppressing and oppressing its own people. Our North Korea diplomacy, which you assured this committee you'd have wrapped up within a year, about 2 years ago, appears to have flatlined, leaving North Korea with a more capable nuclear and ballistic missile program. Across Africa, the State Department has been woefully absent on issue after issue after issue, most recently in its engagement on negotiations related to management of Nile waters. In the Western Hemisphere, the entirety of our approach seems to be xenophobic, anti-immigrant hysteria, and bullying, all while gutting our institutional capacity to deal with the root causes of migration. There is bipartisan support for a Venezuela policy, yet your approach has left millions of Venezuelans still suffering, and the administration won't even support those who are already exiled here. And even as we struggle with an opioid epidemic, you propose cutting our international narcotics and law enforcement. On climate change, your department has not just failed to be part of the solution, but is becoming part of the problem, actively undermining international efforts to safeguard our planet's future. Our allies in Europe, in Asia, in the Middle East, routinely wonder out loud whether we can really be counted on. And our values have been denigrated, from President Trump's reported green-lighting of concentration camps in Xinjiang to the revisionist and at times sometimes repulsive views espoused by your so-called unalienable rights commission. And in the face of a global pandemic, when our scientists, our technology, and our diplomats should be leading the global response, we have instead taken a back seat and are witnessing the collapse of leadership both home and abroad. Rather than putting forth a real strategy, our leaders point fingers at China and the World Health Organization, are absent from critical global meetings, and refuse to be straight with Congress and the American people on the public health threat. All the while, infections and deaths surge across the country. Of course, as we all know, the strength of our diplomacy starts and ends with the strength of our diplomatic corps. Earlier this week, I released a report, Diplomacy in Crisis, the Trump administration's decimation of the State Department. And I have a copy here just in case you haven't seen it, and I'd ask unanimous consent to enter into the record, Mr. Chairman.
Will be entered.
The report found a State Department at risk of catastrophic failure, with career diplomats describing a, quote, complete and utter disdain for their expertise, and even, quote, a contempt for career employees, many asking, quote, if their service is still valued. And even as President Trump refers to our diplomats as the, quote, deep State Department, you have stood at his shoulder and said nothing, exemplified by your refusal to stand behind Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch. The result is an exodus of expertise. 7% of the department's staff left in the first year and a half of the administration. And while I realize that you were not at the department during that time, the department has continued to suffer persistent vacancies without Senate-confirmed nominees. And in response, the administration repeatedly puts forth candidates who do not possess the qualifications, the demeanor, nor the temperament to serve in leadership positions and represent the American people abroad. When you send us qualified nominees, Mr. Secretary, we act. we have confirmed more than 190 nominees, and dozens have advanced quickly and without incidents. But you continuously send us nominees who have misled Congress, who have made offensive or racist statements, who have sexual harassment lawsuits and allegations against them, who have supported torture, and whose conduct would disqualify them for service in any other administration. The administration promised us, quote, the best people, the very best, terrific, tremendous. But, Mr. Secretary, the best people don't seem to want to work for you. Finally, let me just touch on a few oversight issues which I know you were passionate about as a former member of Congress. At your direction, the President recently removed the State Department's Inspector General, who was investigating, perhaps among other things, last year's emergency declaration of arms sales to Saudi Arabia, about which I, along with a bipartisan group of colleagues, raised serious concerns. Additionally, we have learned of allegations of you using your office to promote your own personal domestic political agenda, hosting lavish dinners at the department, and creating at least the appearance of using taxpayer resources to impress high-profile political donors. While this hearing is ostensibly convened for the President's FY21 budget request, you and I and everybody on this dais knows that the President's wish to completely gut our international affairs budget by a shocking 34% is dead on arrival. That said, I have to say, I must say, I'm tempted to provide you with a budget request and see how you could actually operate under it. Even if this budget hearing were not months after the fact and far too late in the legislative process, let me just say it's fundamentally misguided and unsuited to the needs of safeguarding our nation's security. Now, I recognize you'll take issue with much of what I've said, Mr. Secretary, but facts are a stubborn thing. When you entered office, I offered a hand to work with you in areas where we could build real agendas with bipartisan political buy-in. Venezuela, Iran, Russia, China, and indeed, I'm disappointed. But as I look at your tenure in office and at the track record of this administration, I'm disappointed that instead of making America first among the nations of the world, you have instead relinquished our leadership to the applause and approval of China and Russia. That makes America last. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
As we proceed, first let me say, obviously, those views are the views of Senator Menendez individually, not those of this chairman or the majority of this committee. For the members of this committee, we have an 11:30 hard stop that will give us time for a round of questions. I'm going to take a short break about halfway through. As usual, we would stick with what has been a long-standing commitment of this committee for civility, and when the witness is asked a question, we're going to give the witness full opportunity to answer that question and not interrupt his answer simply because he's doing so well at answering the question. And I will enforce that strictly. With that, Secretary Pompeo, the floor
Mr.
is
Chairman,
yours.
if I may have a parliamentary inquiry, you just discussed the procedural process. If we're going to have answers that are filibusters, I don't expect that we're going to allow that either.
Yeah. Senator Menendez, I'll run the committee, and I'll do it as I've indicated. We're not going to interrupt answers from the witness. With that, Secretary Pompeo.
Thank you, Chairman Risch, Ranking Member Menendez. I have a full statement in the interest of time. I'll just read the first approximately 1/3 of that. If I could get your agreement to put the rest of the statement on the record, I'd appreciate that.
We'll do that, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you very much. Today I'm here to present and testify about the President's 2021 budget. It requests nearly $41 billion for the State Department and USAID, enabling both agencies to protect U.S. citizens, increase American prosperity, and advance the development of democratic societies. And critically, it reflects a commitment to the strategic, efficient use of resources to provide better results for the American people. That's the top line analysis, but I want to make a broader point that our diplomatic expenditures reflect America's values. 2 weeks ago in Philadelphia, I unveiled the report of the State Department's Commission on Unalienable Rights. My message that day was simple. The Trump administration places our founding principles at the very core of American diplomacy. I want to talk about how we've done that in 3 areas. First, securing the American people's freedoms against authoritarian threats. securing American lives during the pandemic, and helping friends across the world secure those very unalienable rights. On authoritarian threats, we've evaluated the world with the same realism that the American founders did. We see the Islamic Republic of Iran for what it is, an aggressor, not a victim. We've gone full bore on our maximum pressure campaign since May of 2018. We've slashed the vital oil revenues the regime uses for terrorism and illegal nuclear activities by 90%. We've rallied nations to our side through diplomacy, witnessed the designations of Hezbollah from European and South American countries. And we've bolstered our military readiness vis-a-vis Tehran. There's more work to do. The Security Council must renew the UN arms embargo against Iran before it expires on October 18th. Iran already mines ships in the Straits of Hormuz, launches missiles at Saudi oil facilities, and ships arms to the Houthis. Should the Security Council fail to act, Iran will have a freer hand to sow destruction across the Middle East and indeed the world. Russia, too, is a destabilizing authoritarian force in Ukraine, in Libya, in Syria, and inside of Western democracies. This administration has acted to protect our interests and our friends. We've issued the Crimea Declaration. We've supplied Ukraine with lethal military hardware. We've sanctioned more than 360 Russian targets for everything from human rights abuses to supporting the murderous Assad regime to operating mercenaries and proxy forces around the world. And the State Department's FY 2021 request for the Global Engagement Center is $138 million, more than double its current level. We won't tolerate disinformation and other propaganda directed by the Kremlin or any of our other adversaries. Further on Russia, 2 weeks ago, the State Department removed Nord Stream 2's exemption under CATSA, and in December, the administration's swift implementation of PISA, an important bipartisan endeavor, effectively halted construction of the pipeline. We're the toughest administration ever on Russia. Most importantly, on China, we see the Chinese Communist Party also for what it is, the central threat of our times. Our vigorous diplomacy has helped lead an international awakening to the threat of the CCP. Senators, the tide's turning. 30-plus countries and territories have become 5G clean countries, banning untrusted vendors from their networks. When we talked about this some year ago, the number was in the single digits. In our hemisphere, Canada has stood firm against the Chinese Communist Party's hostage-taking. Its 3 major telecom carriers have also banned untrusted vendors. Belize and Haiti have denounced Beijing's national security law targeting Hong Kong. Denmark has rejected the CCP's attempted censorship of Danish newspapers. Sweden has closed its Confucius Institutes. Lithuanian intelligence services have identified China as a potential threat for the first time. And in the region, in the Indo-Pacific, Australia declared China's South China Sea claims unlawful and illegitimate, as have we. And we're proud to have stepped up maritime maneuvers in that body of water alongside our friends from Australia and Japan and the United Kingdom. India has banned 106 Chinese applications that threatened its citizens' privacy and security. Our diplomatic efforts are working, and momentum is building to mitigate the threats that the Chinese Communist Party presents. All 10 ASEAN nations have insisted that the South China Sea disputes must be settled on the basis of international law, including UNCLOS. Japan led the G7's condemnation of China's national security law targeting Hong Kong. The EU condemned the law too, and also declared China a systemic rival just last year. And we've agreed to start a dialogue channel focused solely on China at the EU's request. At NATO, Secretary General Stoltenberg has called to make China a greater part of that alliance's focus as well. And we led a multilateral effort to ensure that the United Nations World Intellectual Property Organization elected a director from a country that actually gave a darn about intellectual property rights. And our Quad, the United States, Australia, India, and Japan, has been reinvigorated. We've worked hard at this. Our diplomats have done wonderful work. I'm very proud of the progress we are making. In addition to these multilateral efforts, the Department of Justice is cracking down on Chinese IP threats. We've sanctioned Chinese leaders for their brutality in Xinjiang, imposed export controls on companies that support it, and warned U.S. businesses against using slave labor in their supply chains. We've terminated special treatment agreements with Hong Kong in response to the CCP's actions to deny freedom to the people of Hong Kong, and we closed our consulate in Houston because it was a den of spies. Our budget reflects this effort's the reality on the ground. We requested nearly $1.5 billion for foreign assistance to the Indo-Pacific region, a 20% increase from the 2020 request. We want that part of the world to be free and open and prosperous. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll close and happy to take questions.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I appreciate that. We are going to do questioning on a seniority basis since it is the Secretary at Cabinet level, as opposed to the usual first-come rule. And again, I'd ask each member to be respectful of other members and stick to the 5 minutes you're allotted. And once we've gone around, we'll make a determination of where we're going to go from there. With that, Senator Menendez.
Mr. Chairman, I see 7 minutes on the clock. Is that what it's going to be, or is it?
I intended to do a 5. We can do, let's do a 7, because that will just about take up the time. But we're going to have to stick right to that 7, because otherwise people aren't going to get a chance. So
thank you, Mr.
We'll do 7.
Mr. Secretary, as I outlined in my opening statement, Vladimir Putin's investment in Donald Trump prior to the 2016 election clearly continues to pay off handsomely. Withdrawing troops from Germany. Troops in Germany is not about Germany. Troops in Germany is about our own national security interests. Redirecting funds from the European Deterrence Initiative, that's an initiative, as you well know, to deter Russia, to pay for the president's ineffective border wall, and refusing to follow the law and impose meaningful sanctions under CAATSA. But perhaps most shockingly, while we have all known for some time that Russia has provided support to the Taliban, both arms and resources, imposing bounties on the heads of U.S. service members is an outrageous escalation. President Trump astonishingly admitted in an interview on Tuesday that he's never raised the issue with Mr. Putin, even though he's spoken to him about 7 times this year alone. Mr. Secretary, do you consider how you would react to such behavior from a Democratic president if you were sitting in your old House seat? Would you be okay with a president who abandoned our troops but not even raising this with the Kremlin?
Mr. Chairman, you a ranking member, you've identified 4 items where you're concerned about our actions with respect to Russia. I'd like to address each of them. That's what I think about as Secretary
I only
of
asked
State.
one question.
Yes, I don't spend much time thinking about what I would have done were I still in the House of Representatives. I'm very focused on my job as Secretary of State today.
Would you be okay? All right, let me ask you this. Have you raised concerns with Russia and its Foreign Minister Lavrov with respect to Russia reportedly placing bounties on the heads of service members in Afghanistan?
Well, I want to be very careful about what's public record and what's intelligence-based, but yes, I can assure you and the American people that each time I've spoken with Foreign Minister Lavrov, I've raised all of the issues that put any American interest at risk, whether it's our soldiers on the ground in Syria, soldiers on the ground in Afghanistan, the activities that are taking place in Libya, the actions in Ukraine. Each and every one of these that potentially threaten American interests are things that I raised in my conversations with Foreign Minister Lavrov, and I speak with him with some frequency.
I appreciate that answer. I ask you specifically, have you raised concerns? This is in the public sphere. I'm not talking about classified
It's not classified,
materials.
Senator.
Have you raised, there are public reports, very well documented, that the Russians were supposedly paying bounties to kill our service members. Have you raised that issue with Foreign Minister Lavrov?
Senator, I'm going to be more careful than you're being with respect to the intelligence. I'm going to tell you that, make no mistake about it, the proper people have been aware of every single threat to our soldiers on the ground in Afghanistan, whether that was General Miller or my team at the embassy there in Kabul. Anytime there was a tactical threat on the lives or the health or the safety and security or our assets in place, we have raised this with our Russian counterparts, not only at my level, but Ambassador Sullivan and every one of our team that interacts with the Russians. We've made very clear our expectations.
Let me turn
not to threaten us in Afghanistan.
Let me turn to a few other questions. Maybe you can answer these just simply yes or no. I think they're just factual in nature. Did Turkey purchase the S-400 system from the Russian Federation?
Yes.
Did Turkey pay approximately $2.5 billion for that system?
Senator, I'm not aware of the amount of the transaction.
But they did pay them whatever the amount is, right?
Senator, I believe that's correct.
Does-
Although, Senator, I apologize. I am not certain that the cash has been exchanged.
Does the Turkish government currently have the S-400 in its possession?
It has an S-400, yes.
Did Turkey test the S-400 radar on an American-built F-16 in November of 2019, as was publicly reported?
Senator, I'm not going to answer that question. I'm not going to discuss classified information in this setting.
Has the president raised the S-400 with President Erdogan?
I don't talk about things that the president speaks about with foreign counterparts. The White House is free to do that if they choose, but I'm not going to.
So let me ask you a simple question. You sent me a response just on Monday saying that you take your responsibilities under CATSA seriously and that you fully intend to comply with the law. Well, all of these elements clearly are in violation of CATSA. So over a year since all of these facts have attached, when will the administration follow the law and impose CATSA sanctions on Turkey?
Senator, in response to the Turkish government's acquisition of the S-400, we've taken significant actions that have had a real impact on Turkey. We've pulled out a very significant weapons program that they were building significant pieces of inside of Turkey, the F-35 program, and we continue to evaluate how to apply sanctions in order to achieve our end objective. Our end objective isn't to punish, it's to ensure that our NATO partner acts in a way that's consistent with American national security and the security of our NATO partners as well. Our diplomats, Ambassador Satterfield on the ground, are working diligently.
I had a very pointed question. I know that you're a Harvard graduate, West Point graduate. You know what my question was. It's not about everything else. It's about CATSA. But you decided not to answer that. So let me go to the final question. You had the Inspector General of the State Department, Mr. Linick, ultimately fired. Is that correct?
I recommended to the President that he be terminated, yes.
And you recommended it to the President he be terminated. Why? Because he was conducting investigations that may affect you?
Senator, at the time I made the recommendation to the President, I was unaware of any of the investigations that were ongoing, that he had ongoing at the time, with one exception. I was aware of an investigation that he had asked me to provide testimony. I provided that testimony. Other than that, I was unaware of any investigation. It's not remotely the reason.
Was your Undersecretary, Mr. Bulletale, aware, and didn't he speak to you about it?
He did not speak to me about it.
Well, you said that the IG was not performing in the way he should have because he wasn't following, in essence, what you wanted to. Well, Inspector Generals aren't supposed to follow what the department head wants to. They're supposed to be independent in pursuit of their mission. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Johnson.
Mr. Secretary, welcome. Thank you for your service. I think we can all acknowledge the world's a complex and messy place. And as the ranking member said, you know, facts are stubborn things, and administrations have track records. Just a quick review, you came into office, President Trump came into office with a big mess, a lot of messes that you had to clean up. Let me just quick go through them. Libya, a failed state because of President Obama's actions. Syria had gone from a few hundred dead over his administration to basically a genocide, about 500,000 people killed in Syria. What I consider is one of the historic blunders in foreign policy, the removal of troops from Iraq allowed ISIS to rise from the thoroughly defeated ashes of al-Qaeda in Iraq. Crimea had been illegally annexed. Eastern Ukraine invaded. And President Obama did not provide the lethal defensive weaponry on a unanimous basis that Congress authorized him to do. North Korea was rampantly testing missiles and their nuclear weapons. Iran, through that agreement, it changed their behavior for the worst. It emboldened them. And of course, illegal immigration, primarily in the form of family units, exploiting laws that weren't being enforced in this country, was exploding. So President Trump came into office with a lot of foreign policy messes. By the way, last time I looked, under this administration, we've started no new wars. We've destroyed the physical caliphate of ISIS. General Soleimani, al-Baghdadi are off the field. President Trump actually provided those lethal defensive weaponry, the javelins, which helped stabilize the situation in Iran. And quite honestly, we've done a pretty good job at reducing that out-of-control illegal immigration from the southern border by diplomacy with Guatemala is one of the things that occurred there. So I think we have to put those track records and compare them and talk honestly about these things. Now, the ranking member has been pretty brutal regarding the firing of Inspector General Linick. I was copied on a letter that Under Secretary of Management Bulatalo wrote to Mr. Horowitz. I've read it. It's somewhat complex. I just want to give you an opportunity to talk about what happened. And by the way, I'm very sensitive to Inspector Generals or trying to push Inspector Generals to investigate the leaks of these departments. There were 126 leaks having to do with national security in the first 125 days of this administration. That needs to be investigated. And I'm not, if you could describe the leaks that you were concerned about and exactly how Inspector General Linick didn't handle that the way you thought it should be handled.
Sure. So thank you, Senator Johnson. Let me just say, I value Inspectors General as well. I had a great relationship with the Inspector General at the CIA when I was there. He did his job. He took care of the team. He was critical of the agency when we got it wrong. I know what a good IG can do. Inspector General Linick wasn't that. The incident you're referring to is that we had a very sensitive Inspector General report. When the final draft was prepared, it leaked. The Politico reporter, I think, said it came from two people close to the investigation. At that point, it was basically the IG's office and a couple of others that actually knew about it in the full report, which had a real impact on senior State Department officials' lives. When we confronted the Inspector General, he was defensive. We then asked him to undertake a process. He ignored that request to inspect, to have a separate IG come and investigate. It's pretty complicated, but suffice it to say, he didn't comply with the instructions about how we felt that leak needed to be investigated so that we could have an independent investigator do it, and then he wasn't candid about that process either. He didn't act with integrity throughout that process in a way that Inspector Generals have to be counted on to behave.
Well, I had my own issues with Inspector General Linick. I won't go into those. Right now, I'm being falsely, Senator Grassley and I are being falsely accused of peddling in Russian disinformation. Because of acting Director of National Intelligence Grinnell's efforts to declassify 4 footnotes in the Michael Horowitz's IG report, we now know that the Russian disinformation that was involved in the 2016 campaign was bought and paid for by the DNC. The Clinton campaign was contained in the Steele dossier. That is the truth. That is the Russian disinformation. I have heard no outrage on the part of our Democratic colleagues about that Russian disinformation. But we are still undergoing our investigation, and we're trying to seek documents out of the State Department involved in that Steele dossier. And let me just ask you a specific question. In October 2016, former State Department official Jonathan Weiner arranged for Christopher Steele to provide other State Department officials the anti-Trump dossier he compiled for the DNC in the Clinton campaign. That same month, Mr. Weiner gave Mr. Steele information collected by Clinton supporters, which Mr. Steele then passed on to the FBI. This conduct raises serious concerns under the Hatch Act, Federal Records Act, and other department policies. Although then IG Linick acknowledged conducting a review of this conduct, he has not published any of his findings and admitted that the OIG did not interview any of the key players. Are you aware of these issues, and can you commit commit that the department will be responsive to our request from Senator Grassley and myself? We need these documents.
Senator, we'll do our best to be responsive. We understand the requests. We're working through it. And yes, I'm familiar with the information that you set forth there with respect to the behavior that took place in October of 2016 in the State Department.
Were there any other specific incidents that caused you to ask for the removal of Inspector General Linick?
Yes, there were several. Look, at the end, it's about the core mission, accomplishing the core function. One of the central functions to make sure that we can represent to you all that the financial statement for the State Department is accurate and full. We have an audit team to do that. Inspector General Linick screwed that up. I'll read from the investigative report. It said, oversight by the OIG was demonstrably ineffective, ultimately placing the department's information as well as the reputation, human capital, and operations at considerable and unnecessary risk. That's an enormous failure for one of the most important tasks that the IG's office does, conduct the audit of the State Department's books. There's a handful of others. he refused to take care of his team in important ways. There were 10% fewer audits of our posts around the world. One of the most important functions, aside from the audit, is to travel around the posts and conduct audits to make sure that they're conducting business appropriately. We were down about 10%. And I must tell you, morale inside the IG's office, we have 38 assistant secretary level bureaus. The IG's office was the worst survey results of any of those 38. He didn't take care of his people either.
He also did not investigate the improper use of personal emails in the State Department, which was rampant under the previous administration.
Thank you, Senator
thank you.
Johnson. Senator Cardin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here.
Yes, sir.
America's strength is in our values. We are the global leader for democratic values. We have been so recognized, and we've worked with the international community as the leader of the free world, with other countries that share our values. And we led in that, and one of the best examples was the passage of the Magnitsky sanctions, the global Magnitsky, which was not just bipartisan, it was pretty much universal here in supporting, promoting U.S. values. I was glad to work with the late Senator McCain on the passage of that legislation, and now Canada, Europe, Australia are all following our leadership to enforce universally recognized democratic values. So when the United States isolates itself from our traditional allies, it affects our credibility as a global leader of the free world in promoting democratic values. So when we pulled out of the climate agreement, when we isolated ourselves on Iran, when our trade policies have been more bilateral rather than working with other countries in order to try to advance our causes against non-market economies or government-controlled economies, all that affects America's credibility. So when I look at your budget, I see a decline of 35% in democracy funds. To me, I don't understand that cut. 35% if we're going to be the leader in democratic values. But then I was pleased to hear you mention as the first order of your remarks today, human rights and values, American values. But I was disappointed that you used the Commission on Inalienable Rights as the example. And I say that because in my conversations with human rights advocates, not just here but globally, they look at the United States trying to promote a political agenda on rights rather than working with the international community, the free world, on democratic principles of human rights. So tell me how this commission has engaged the activists globally that are fighting every day for human rights when it is very much tied towards a particular political view rather than a universal view on human rights.
Senator, I appreciate the answer to talk a little bit about the commission and the objective I set out now just over a year ago with respect to it. I'd urge everyone to take a look at it and read it. I think they did phenomenal work. I don't agree with everything that's in there. I don't think any of the 10 members that came from broad religious backgrounds, broad political backgrounds, I don't think any of the 10 of them agree with just everything in there. But what it set out to do was take on what is an enormous crisis in the 20th century's human rights project. We're in a really bad place all around the world. And it was my view as I watched the State Department, our DRL, all the folks who work on this, who are great and amazing people, I watched as they were unmoored. They didn't have a founding. And so I wanted to go back and talk about how do we moor American foreign policy and American human rights policy in the traditions of the United States. And so that's what the commission was asked to do.
Well, I guess what I don't understand is what was the problem that you're trying to solve?
Yes,
there's been a great deal of debate
Yes.
in establishing universal values of human rights,
Yes.
which has been the core for democratic states. And now all of a sudden we're picking winners and losers, but it looks like it's done on a political basis. Let me move to a second subject, if I might, on arms sales. We have a proud tradition of making sure that when we supply arms to other countries that they're not used against our human rights values. And we've seen in recent years that arms provided by the United States has ended up in the hands of actors that we do not want to see get those arms. What oversight are you deploying to make sure that arms that we make available to other countries are used for the intended purpose and do not end up in for the wrong use?
Senator, we have an elaborate process to do our best to verify that that doesn't happen. It's not that we don't that we don't have escapes, that there aren't failures. It's certainly the case. That's been true for an awfully long time, but we have an elaborate process to validate and verify. We require representations, we do verification, we do inspections. We have big teams in multiple departments that have responsibility for doing their best to ensure that American weapon systems are used for their intended purpose when we sell them or provide them to our partners and allies around the world.
Let me make this offer. I think this committee can help you in that regards. And the jurisdictional battle between defense and state sometimes presents challenges. States has the principal role for a good reason. There's some legislation that I've authored that would help in that regard. I would hope that you would engage us to give you the tools you need to take on it sometimes the military aspects of the Defense Department that may not be as sensitive to these values. That's
Senator, I appreciate that very much. I do think the State Department is the proper place to lodge the primary responsibility for that activity, so I welcome your efforts there.
The GAO recently issued a report that I had requested in regards to diversity. And the report's titled, State Department Additional Steps Are Needed to Identify Potential Barriers to Diversity. And they point out that from the period from 2002, well before your time, to 2018, we've seen a decline of minorities in positions within the State Department, and it's particularly pronounced within the higher ranks. What steps are you taking to implement the GAO concerns?
So, Senator, I've seen that GAO report. I've seen the internal work we've done. I would characterize it over the last, that you were talking about from 2002, over the last decade roughly as flat. That's not good enough. That's multiple parties. This is not partisan at all. We want to get this right. We've undertaken a number of things. We have about a third today of our members who are minorities. Excuse me, about 44% of them are women. We've developed the Pickering-Rangel program to bring more people in. We had double the applications this year. We have a big team that works on diversity and inclusion. We're almost finished with a major study that was begun now, I think, 13 months ago, run by Carol Perez, our DJHR, to look at what the failures. There's been a lot of money and effort on diversity and inclusion over this last decade with, to your point, relatively good outcomes for acquisition of new talented people, but less so at the senior levels. Trying to identify why we haven't.
I hope we could work together on that. Last point, just a point on Western Hemisphere on the ranking. I would just urge you to evaluate working with us on the aid to the Northern Triangle to make sure that they have the help from the United States to deal with the economic issues, which takes away the pressure and migration from the Northern Triangle. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Gardner. Senator Gardner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Secretary, for your service and being here today. Over the last several years on the Asia Subcommittee, we've been working together on this committee to shape a new policy toward the Indo-Pacific. The region obviously is burgeoning in population and promising commercial growth, and it's critical for global security and economic stability. But North Korea continues to seek nuclear weapons and to threaten its neighbors. China is an emerging global power that's intimidating its neighbors, brutally suppressing its own citizens, and attempting to remake the world order in its own image. In Burma, the military is committing grievous human rights abuses against the minority Rohingya population. It's more important than ever that the United States maintains a presence in the Indo-Pacific region, reaffirms alliances, encourages economic cooperation, and promotes human rights and the rule of law. The administration and Congress must be united on implementing a long-term strategy that will benefit American national security interests, promote American businesses and create jobs through trade promotion and opportunities, and project American values of respect for the human rights and freedom in the Indo-Pacific region. This includes countering China's growing militarization of the South China Seas and increasing malign influence in Southeast Asia, as well as ensuring that complete, verified, and irreversible denuclearization is achieved on the Korean Peninsula as codified in U.S. law. The United States has always been and will always remain a Pacific power, and legislation like my Asia Reassurance Initiative Act, or ARIA, ensures that the U.S. government will speak with one voice to reassure our allies and to deter our adversaries in the Indo-Pacific region. In 2018, the Asia Subcommittee held a three-part hearing series. We talked about democracy, human rights, and rule of law. We found that mass concentration camps for Uyghur Muslims necessitated a serious response from the U.S. and the international community. That crackdowns in the Tibet Autonomous Region are intensifying while Beijing continues to refuse negotiations with the Central Tibetan administration. That human rights defenders in China are routinely jailed and tortured I was obviously pleased to see that several Chinese officials were sanctioned for abuses against Uyghurs, and even in the 11 Chinese entities implicated in similar abuses were added to the Commerce Department's entity list. But what is the administration doing to address further global Magnitsky sanctions and other remedies for these abuses?
So Senator Gardner, thanks, and I'm familiar with the area. It's great work, and I want to thank this committee and frankly the broader group of senators for the bipartisan legislation that we had with respect to the Uyghurs and respect to Hong Kong democracy as well. It's very powerful when I can talk to my counterparts around the world and say that I have not only the support of Congress, but bipartisan, almost unanimous support on our policy with respect to securing freedom against the threats that the Chinese Communist Party is presenting. As for what we'll continue to do in Western China with respect to the horrific human rights violations that are taking place against the ethnic minorities there, I don't want to get in front of the final decisions, but you can rest assured that there are further actions, including further actions with respect to human rights violations that the Department of State and the Department of Treasury are working to complete.
Mr. Secretary, yesterday, I don't know if you had a chance to see some of the hearing in the House of Representatives regarding some of the tech companies operating in the United States. And I'll read you some of the comments they made when asked whether or not China is stealing information from them. Apple CEO Tim Cook said he had no personal knowledge about Chinese technology theft. Jeff Bezos has no firsthand experience beyond knockoff products. Google CEO has said that they didn't have any experience, later had clarified that remark. Can you talk a little bit about tech and China and what you see, what's happening? Is it true that there's no Chinese technology theft of U.S. companies?
Well, they need to get out more. I mean, there's a long history, decades-long history of Chinese intellectual property threat, including against technologies. And I hear it. It's sometimes the case you hear it privately because there's continued threats made against their businesses that are operating not only in China, but threats to businesses that are actually working in other parts of Asia and Southeast Asia as well. The Chinese Communist Party is completely willing to bully and to threaten to get companies to behave.
Do you work with these tech companies at the State Department on intellectual property theft, cyber attack, those kinds of things?
We do. We work closely with them, and on the side of protecting cyber, we've actually had some good work where we've worked alongside each other on important projects where we have reduced risk, and so I thank them for that. But the idea that anyone in the tech space could not know of what the Chinese Communist Party is attempting to steal and the cyber attacks they're making seems incredulous.
In March of this year, as related to some Chinese misinformation and the dissemination of misinformation when it came to the COVID-19 propaganda China was spreading, I suggested the National Security Council set up a task force at the White House to counter that disinformation. Are the tech companies doing enough to combat Chinese disinformation?
No, there's always more that they can do. There's more we can do as well. On that particular front, I must say, I actually think the world mounted a very effective counter-campaign against the Chinese disinformation. As I've traveled and as I've spoken to my counterparts, I think the world understands that this virus emanated from China, from Wuhan in particular, and I think the world understands that the Chinese Communist Party showed up with PPE that didn't work and covered up what they knew about that when they could have prevented this spread. So I think the Chinese efforts at disinformation there actually failed in this case.
The Taiwan situation, I wanted to just ask.
Was the effect of diplomatically alienating Germany, who is the largest and wealthiest country in the EU, who has been a historic strategic ally, was that also taken into consideration?
You know, this is personal for me. I fought on the border of East Germany. When I was a young soldier, I was stationed
Yes, I'm
there.
aware of that.
Yeah.
And your unit is coming back to the United States.
I know it. It had been back once before to Fort Polk, and then it went back to Germany. When I was there were 6 figures of soldiers there. Germany is no longer a frontline state. As for our strategic effort, General Secretary Stoltenberg, NATO commander, was very much in the process of helping us think this through. I saw comments out of Russia this morning that are different than you described, that viewed the actions that we took as threatening, because we will have soldiers that are deployed closer to the Russian border. Yes, this was a thoughtful process. The military piece of this run out of the Pentagon largely, but State Department was fully involved in the strategic pieces of this, and I am very confident that our mission to deter Russia, the NATO mission to deter Russia, we are still fully capable of executing. The precise number was 200,000 early, about 100 and some thousand when I was there. Conditions have changed around the world, and our forces need to be repositioned to appropriately confront today's challenges.
Well, I would just read from a report in Bloomberg that quotes Dmitry Peskov, who was the press secretary for Vladimir Putin, who says that, and I quote, "The fewer American soldiers on the European continent, the calmer it is in Europe," Peskov said, answering a question on planned U.S. troop reductions in Germany. That doesn't sound to me like they think that this increases the threat from Russia. But I'd like to go on to another issue, because I want to follow up on the question that Secretary Menendez raised, or Senator Menendez raised, about the reports on bounties that Russia has put on our troops in Afghanistan by the Taliban. And there was a report last night that said that state officials have secretly warned Russia against bounties on our troops, against killing our troops. What more do you think we should be doing to address that, to prevent the Taliban and Russia from trying to murder our troops in Afghanistan?
So there are many things, and we've been engaged in them consistently. There's intelligence collection so that if it happens, we can identify it, stop it, make sure that the actual tactical event doesn't take place. That's the task of not only DoD intelligence services, but our broader intelligence services. Our diplomats, too, make very clear our expectations and set a set of red lines. And then we have our larger Afghanistan policy. It's not just Russia that has been underwriting the Taliban for all these years. I know there's an awful lot of focus on that in this town, but let me tell you, at the State Department, Department of Defense, we're worried about Iranian support to the Taliban. We're worried about Gulf money coming to the Taliban. We are working
I totally agree with that.
We are working diligently against every one of those threats, both diplomatically and from a security perspective, to protect our soldiers. And then finally, to protect our soldiers further, we've been working diplomatically to get peace and reconciliation in Afghanistan. And we have a ceasefire that began at the start of Eid al-Adha. We've now had a significant prisoner exchange. Since February 29th, the agreement entered into, we haven't had a single attack against an American soldier. This is the finest in American diplomacy, and I'm incredibly proud of what my team has done, my State Department team has done to protect American soldiers.
So do you think it would be helpful for President Trump to talk to Vladimir Putin and tell him that he needs to back off in terms of paying the Taliban to kill American troops?
I always leave to the president what he wants to say to other leaders. I don't think there's any doubt in the mind of every Russian leader, including Vladimir Putin, about the expectations of the United States of America not to kill Americans. And I can promise you that the 300 Russians who were in Syria and who took action that threatened America, who are no longer on this planet, understand that too.
When you were here last time, we talked about the potential for negotiations with the Taliban in Afghanistan. That was before an agreement was reached. And there was an exchange that you and I had about the role of Afghan women in any talks with the Taliban. And you said that Afghan women should fend for themselves. Well, we've seen the outcome of our reticence to support Afghan women. The agreement between the U.S. and the Taliban failed to mention the rights of Afghan women, and it contains no guarantees for their continued constitutional protection. Is the policy to have Afghan women fend for themselves consistent, do you believe, with the legal mandate for the U.S. to support the, and I quote, "the meaningful inclusion of women in peace talks as directed by the Women, Peace, and Security Act that was signed into law by President Trump"?
Boy, I'd have to go look and see what I said. No, we're doing our level best to make sure that we protect every Afghan, male and female, and I have seen the at least tentative composition of the Afghan negotiating team, and I think you'll be pleased with it.
Well, I'm out of time, but the fend for themselves is an exact quote from your statement when you were before this committee. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Shaheen. Mr. Secretary, people always say actions speak louder than words. Do you think the specific action the United States of America took against General Soleimani sent a message to every country on this planet of what would happen to people who targeted United States soldiers on the battlefield?
I do.
Thank you. Senator Romney.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. It's a pleasure to see you and appreciate you appearing before this committee. I'm one of many who applauds your recent addresses with regards to China. In these, you have called out their predatory behavior, economic, military, geopolitical, and you note that we have to confront China with our friends and allies if we're going to be successful in diverting them from their course of predation. It's a very welcome assessment, a very clear-eyed evaluation of China's intent and their actions, and a statement of what our mission must be with regards to China. It's also a welcome departure from the President's fawning praise of Xi Jinping and celebration of agreements that China hasn't honored. It's also, in my view, inconsistent with actions that we've taken that have offended our allies at a time we need to be drawing them closer to us. And one, of course, is the steel and aluminum tariffs against our friends and allies that I thought were misplaced. I would have rather focused our entire ammunition on China. The other, of course, is most recently, as Senator Shaheen has just indicated, the withdrawal of troops from Germany, and doing so while expressing an intent to punish Germany for the fact that they spend approximately 1.5% of their GDP on their military as opposed to the 2% NATO target, even though they've indicated that they are on track to get to the 2% number. I have heard from highest levels of the German government that this is seen by them as an insult to Germany. And I can't imagine at a time when we need to be drawing in our friends and allies so that we can collectively confront China, that we want to insult them. My question is this, however, which is what actions will the administration take to bring our allies together in a way that's different than what we've done in the past? I mean, I know that there's always lots of talk going on, and any administration can talk about all the things happening, but what are we going to do that's distinct, that's different, that's dramatic to bring the nations that follow the rule of law together so that we can hopefully reach some kind of a common approach or common strategy in how we're going to deal with China economically, militarily, geopolitically, and then collectively confront them with the intent of dissuading them from pursuing the course that they're on. We obviously don't want to, go to war economically, militarily, or otherwise, but we do want to dissuade them, and I think that can only happen when we are, and as you have pointed out, when we can do that with others. I would note something you said at the Nixon Library. You said, quote, maybe it's time for a new grouping of like-minded nations, a new alliance of democracies. And I think that's a good idea, but I'm interested in what actions of a new and dramatic nature are you considering or are you willing to take in order to accomplish the objective you described?
Senator, it is absolutely the case that to confront the Chinese Communist Party is going to take a global effort. That's absolutely true. It's why I talked about this idea, perhaps, of a new alliance of democracies. What shape that would take, there's lots of discussion about. Had many conversations with friends in the region. Step one, Senator, to be honest with you, has been to awaken the world to this threat. For an awful long time, not just the United States, but the whole world saw that there were lucrative opportunities in China, and that was basically foreign policy. Sell as much as you can, outsource jobs, build supply chains. And so I spent my first year and change traveling the world trying to raise awareness of the threat. So that, I think that's new and different. You may say it's not enough, but it wasn't happening before. And I went through the list of things that have begun to turn the tide. I will say there are still nations who understand this threat but don't feel like they are empowered, that they're in a position where they can withstand the threats that come from the Chinese Communist Party. So we are working, our diplomats, trying to build out a set of relationships. And whether that's part of a formal organization or not, I'm not sure I know the answer to yet, but to convince them that America is prepared to lead in pushing back against the Chinese Communist Party, and when they do, we will be there to support them. And so I could list you, we have some 26 lines of effort at the State Department, probably an equal amount at the Department of Defense, all aimed centrally at building out this set of alliances, both in Southeast Asia and more broadly with our Five Eyes partners and with the Quad, to build out a set of commitments that can robustly communicate to the Chinese Communist Party that enough, and you have to behave on the global stage. If you want to behave on the global stage, you've got to do it under a set of rules that has created so much prosperity around the world. That may be unsatisfying, Senator Romney, but it's still a real work in progress to get everyone fully aligned. I mentioned the EU dialogue, very important. Foreign Minister Borrell, High Representative Borrell, asked me if we would have a dialogue with them on China. That took a lot of effort to get 27 EU nations to say, yes, this is something we've got to confront, to identify as a systemic rival. There's lots of spade work that goes into what seems pretty simple, I suppose.
I think it's the most important work that we will be doing as a country and as an administration as we face this challenge. Just a parenthetical comment that comes to mind as you're speaking, and that relates to a discussion that was held earlier with regards to tech companies that Senator Johnson raised. I know there's great interest, sometimes politically, to go after some of the big tech companies, Google, Amazon, and so forth, and Facebook, and berate them for their market power. And if they violate American antitrust laws, why, that's totally appropriate. But I would note that we're in a global competition, and China has been successful in driving a lot of Western companies out of business. They've not been successful in driving companies like these out of business. These are thriving and succeeding. And the last thing we ought to be doing is trying to knock down businesses in the United States that are succeeding on a global stage. So we need to be careful not to flex our muscle to berate those entities that are successful and are beating China. I mean, Alibaba would like to replace Amazon. TikTok would like to replace Instagram. So it's just an area of concern, and I hope that you're able to point these things out to other members of the administration who care deeply about that. Finally, were you surprised by the fact that, 57 countries supported China, 53 countries supported China's crackdown on Hong Kong? Did that shock you as it did me?
I was surprised and dismayed.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you, Senator Romney. Senator Coons.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, for holding this important hearing today, and thank you, Mr. Secretary. Let me just start with two specific issues, if I can, that I think are important. I want to associate myself with a number of other areas that have been explored, but let me touch on these two. I'm working with members of this committee and your department to resolve terrorism-related claims against Sudan, which is in the middle of a critical democratic transition, to provide justice and compensation for over 700 terror victims and their family members, and to move our bilateral relationship forward after 30 years under the brutal dictatorship of Omar al-Bashir. I just want to urge you and the administration to do everything you can to support Prime Minister Hamdok and to make sure that we seize this opportunity to bring real justice to the victims and their American families and foreign nationals involved, and to build a new democratic partner in the region. Have you personally engaged on this issue, and can you commit to working transparently with Congress as we try to find a solution urgently?
Senator Cruz, thank you for your work. This is really important. We've proposed that there's a legal peace resolution that would be in legislation that will be before Congress here in the very, very near term. We think it's the appropriate time to both bring justice to those from the 1998 bombings and get a real opportunity for Prime Minister Hamdok. I've talked to him a handful of times. I've talked to other of the leaders there in Sudan. This is an opportunity that doesn't come along often. We all know the history of Sudan and the tragedy there. There's a chance not only for democracy to begun to be built out, but perhaps regional opportunities that could flow from that as well. And I think lifting the state sponsor of terrorism designation there, if we can take care of the victims of those tragedies, would be a good thing for American foreign policy, and I appreciate your assistance in that regard.
We have a number of members of this committee with strong interests, and it's my hope that we can move in a way that respects those constituent interests and also makes progress and doesn't miss this moment. On the Global Fragility Act, it's legislation that was bipartisan that I led here with Senator Graham, and President Trump signed into law last December. It requires a long-term whole-of-government strategy to address extremism and instability in fragile states. The first deliverable under this legislation, the Global Fragility Strategy, is due September 15th. Congress really isn't looking for old wine in new bottles, so we just urge you to look at the GFA as a tool to rethink our approach to these challenges and improve the way that state, AID, and DoD work together. How are you using the tools Congress provided in the GFA to address the consequences of this pandemic on development, governance, security? And can you commit that you'll look hard at and resolve a technical issue on the creation of the Prevention and Stabilization Fund, which was designed to replace and improve on the Rapid Response Fund in the statute?
Senator Coons, I'll get back to you on the last question that you asked. I'm familiar with it, but not enough to answer your question, but I'll get you an answer briefly. You're right. I'm tracking the first deliverable. I will say I saw the first pass at this. You characterized it about right. It was there wasn't much that was original in there, and I've asked the team to go back and take a set of fresh looks to ask for outside views, folks on Capitol Hill, people who are experts around the world to see if we can't use this tool that you provided us on a bipartisan basis to actually deliver on the stated objectives of that law. It was an important piece of legislation, and I don't want to miss the chance to develop the strategy that can then underpin all the actions we can take once that strategy is done. It's not something we intend to put on the shelf and admire, but something we hope creates operational opportunities underneath that strategy.
Thank you. Today is the funeral service for a friend and former colleague, Congressman John Lewis. And I was struck by a comment made by your former colleague, former Secretary of Defense, General Mattis, who wrote following the weeks of protests after the unlawful murder of George Floyd. General Mattis wrote, "I've watched this week's unfolding events angry and appalled. The words equal justice under law are carved into the pediment of the Supreme Court, and that is what the protesters are rightly demanding." Do you agree with General Mattis? I'm concerned about the general direction of the most senior levels of the State Department. This has been raised before. I won't go through the GAO report. But of 189 ambassadors representing us abroad, only 3 are African American, 4 are Hispanic, and I recognize that diversity in the department has been a long-term challenge, but I'd be interested in hearing both. Do you agree with General Mattis's comments? And what are you personally doing to mentor the next crop of senior leaders and to diversify the 7th floor leadership team?
Yeah, I actually think the 7th floor leadership team, my entire communications team, my Undersecretary for Management, my Undersecretary for Political Affairs are all part of diversity groups. I'm proud of what our small team has done, but that doesn't begin to accomplish what we need to get done in the State Department to make sure we get this right. By the way, it is diversity and inclusion that is broad-based. We need to make sure that we have people from all across America with all viewpoints, every idea from all across America. We have been very narrow in how we have recruited from a certain set of institutions and certain universities, and we don't get a full spectrum of understandings of America or of the world if we are too narrow in how we think about diversity and inclusion. So we're working hard at it. We've built out a set of programs. Your point about not having sufficient minority representation in our ambassadorial levels is absolutely true. I guess it was 3 days ago, a set of about 23 that'll be coming to you shortly. We had more than half of them that were female, first time that's ever happened. So we're making progress, but I would agree that the rate of change is insufficient.
How do you think our own failure to address structural racial inequality impacts our diplomacy overseas and impacts our ability to advocate around human rights issues?
Well, it's important that we get it right at home. There's no doubt about that. And I would tell you that we are a beacon for that around the world. I think you can see it in people who want to come to the United States of America because it's the freest nation. It's a place that you have immigrants from all across the world that want to come here. And I'm a believer that people vote with their feet. They see America still as this greatest, most exceptional nation. We are not without flaws, but I think as our diplomats travel the world, they can be very proud of our progress along this.
Mr. Secretary, I want to ask a last question about our election. President Trump has just tweeted that we should delay it. I'm interested in whether you were able to vote by mail when you served abroad in the Army, whether you vote by mail in your home state of Kansas, whether, like many of us who serve in Congress in both parties, you've availed yourself, as do virtually all of our diplomats and development professionals and armed forces members, of the opportunity to vote securely by mail. Have you done so, and do you have any concerns about the security of our election this November?
Senator Coons, I believe I have voted by absentee ballot. I think while I was a soldier, and I also think when I was a member of Congress, I did a couple times as well. The State Department has some role in making sure we have election security. It's not our primary focus. So I'll leave to others those who have that primary centered focus.
But is there any reason for us to be concerned that those votes are fraudulent or somehow ineligible to be counted if cast by mail or by absentee ballot by our diplomats?
I must say, having a small group of people vote by absentee ballot is very different than deciding that you're going to conduct a full in-mail balloting program. Those are two fundamentally different beasts. I'll leave to the professionals to identify the level of risk associated with that. But I also know, and I saw this in my home state of Kansas, when you change the voting rules in close to an election, it's a difficult task.
Thank you, Senator Coons. Senator Rubio.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Secretary. Thank you for coming in and being here. I know election security is not your area of expertise, but I think you can comment on what I'm about to ask. I'm sure you're well aware of influence efforts on the part of the Chinese in Taiwan to shape Taiwanese policies, the policies of their government. I'm certain, as most people on this committee, I hope, are aware of how they pressure political figures that they view are opposed to their interests. And I think we've all witnessed, I think you'll confirm this worldwide, that China has engaged in efforts of disinformation, particularly, for example, about the coronavirus. I'm not asking you to comment specifically about our country. I think I'm more than anything else asking, if China ever decided they wanted to do those kinds of things to us, would you assess they have the capability to conduct disinformation campaign to pressure American political figures, potentially even members of Congress, the way we've seen them do Taiwan and Australia and in other places? If they decided they wanted to do that, this is second largest economy in the world, pretty significant capabilities. If they ever decided they wanted to come after us that way, they'd have the capability to do it, would they not?
Senator, I'll take it if I may have just a second to respond to this. They certainly have the capability. I've talked about this. The United Front, the Chinese United Front, is working here in the United States today. They're meeting with state legislators. They're meeting with governors. They're running one of the things that was taking place out of the consulate in Houston were influence operations conducted by their diplomats. And this isn't, I all know we have diplomats from all across the world who come to our offices as members of Congress and talk to us about policy. This what I'm talking about is fundamentally different from that. So they not only have the capability, but the intention of conducting influence operations in the United States. I think we're a pretty resilient nation. I'm confident that we'll push back against that. But the world needs to understand that when it's happening here in the United States, it's happening all across, it's happening in their countries too.
Well, I think one of the things that was most interesting yesterday is the 4 CEOs of these tech companies appeared, I believe, before a House committee yesterday, if I'm not mistaken, and they were asked a very simple question. Do you believe, they were asked, do they believe that China steals technology from U.S. firms? They were asked this question. I think there's pretty strong consensus across the board in both parties and in the media and elsewhere that the answer to that question is yes. The CEO of Apple said they haven't experienced it. That was his answer. And the CEO of Google said, neither have we. And the CEO of Amazon says, oh, I've read that. Only the CEO of Facebook said, yes, absolutely. So Apple, Google, and Amazon answered that question by saying either they hadn't experienced it or they've read that somewhere but wouldn't comment further. Why would corporations such as this, some of whom, by the way, take it upon themselves to censor truth versus what's not true and what they believe some people should be saying and not others on the basis of what they judge to be true, why would 3 of the 4 CEOs of the 4 largest tech companies headquartered in the United States be afraid to answer that question?
Senator, I can only speculate. I mean, it's patently clear to anyone who's watching that the Chinese are engaged in intense efforts at intellectual property threat, including to technology.
Would it be fair in your mind to speculate that they try to influence people even in the business community?
Absolutely.
Okay. One more question. I think I know the answer to this as well, but would you agree with the belief, I think, again, that's pretty widespread, that China has systematically identified industries and technologies that they believe will be key to the 21st century? They actually wrote it Made in China 2025. And they've undertaken a systematic effort to dominate these industries while destroying our capability. They've done it. That's what the IP theft is about, the forced transfer of technology, subsidies to their firms, blocking access to their markets. There is no doubt at this point that they have a very carefully crafted plan to dominate certain key industries for the 21st century and to wipe out not just our capabilities in those industries, but everybody else's. That's a fair assessment.
Yes, Senator Rubio, and they've not been covert about this, right? They've spoken openly about how they're approaching their commercial interests. The only thing that they don't speak about is that rather than build these industries inside, the tools that they use are fundamentally different than the way Western democracies do, right? We train our people, we build our businesses, we invest capital in the market. They run state-sponsored enterprises, they steal intellectual property, and then they endeavor to undermine other companies and threaten and bully countries around the world into buying their products.
My last question is unrelated to China directly, but as you're well aware, there have been press reports, speculations, commentators and the like that have made much about recent allegations, and in one case, an interview the president gave in which they took from it that the president would be willing to engage in negotiations with Maduro and the Maduro regime in Venezuela. As you understand our policy, being in the position that you're in, could you envision, as long as this administration is in office, we would ever negotiate with the Maduro regime for them to remain in power?
Absolutely not. Our policy is not to negotiate for them for anything other than his departure from ruling that country.
Thank you.
Thank you. After the next questioner, we're going to take a 10-minute recess, but right now, Senator Udall, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Secretary Pompeo. Appreciate your time and testimony today. I want to start with an important subject, democracy promotion. Earlier this year, you called for free and fair elections in Venezuela and Nicaragua. If free and fair elections are held and the current occupants of power lose, the State Department then strongly encourages those leaders to step down from power. And I think that sort of thing is an important pillar of our foreign policy on a bipartisan basis, correct?
Yes, sir.
But I am hearing growing concern in this country about whether we are going to set a good example in our November election. In a recent Fox News interview, Chris Wallace asked President Trump whether he would give a, quote, direct answer that you will accept the election, unquote, in November. In response, President Trump said, I have to see. No, I'm not going to just say yes. No, I'm not going to say no. I didn't say last time either. During a 2016 debate, he stated, I will tell you at the time, I will keep you in suspense. And he's also called voting by mail, as you know, one of the major ways Americans vote, especially in a pandemic. He said over and over again, the election's rigged if it's vote by mail. So, Secretary Pompeo, if President Trump refuses to accept the upcoming November election due to his lack of faith in voting by mail, will you respect the results of a certified election as the State Department typically does throughout the world?
Senator, I'm not going to speculate yet about 15 ifs in there. You should know. I have said repeatedly to this committee, I will follow the rule of law, follow the Constitution. I've endeavored to do that in everything I've done, and I'll continue to do that every day.
The President has made this a legitimate question in Americans' minds through his own statements. Former Pennsylvania Governor and Homeland Security Secretary Tom Ridge, a Republican, as you know, says, and I quote here, I think it's very sad and very disappointing that with almost 5 months to go, the President seems to want to try to delegitimize the November 3rd election. It just seems to me that this may be an indication he's more worried about the outcome than he's worried about the fraud, end quote. This is a serious domestic and foreign policy question. We need to set a good example about the peaceful transition of power, or else we undermine our entire foreign policy. George Kennan wrote in his long telegram that in order to counter the Soviet Union, quote, much depends on the health and vigor of our own society. I think that is just as true today about Russia, China, Venezuela, Iran, and other authoritarian regimes that we have challenges with. And I can imagine few scenarios that would endanger our society more than a presidential candidate who refuses to accept the outcome of an election. Secretary Pompeo, this year the Committee to Protect Journalists issued a report on the harm this president has caused to journalists, First Amendment rights. In their summary, the committee states, and I quote, the Trump administration has stepped up the prosecutions of news sources, interfered in the business of media owners, harassed journalists crossing U.S. borders, and empowered foreign leaders to restrict their own media. But Trump's most effective ploy has been to destroy the credibility of the press, dangerously undermining truth and consensus even as the COVID-19 pandemic threatens to kill tens of thousands of Americans. That's the end of their quote. Are you concerned that instead of promoting press freedom abroad, America is now providing moral support to authoritarian efforts to crack down on critical media outlets from Russia to China to Venezuela and beyond?
No, I'm not remotely concerned about that.
And over 150,000 Americans have now died from COVID-19, and we mourn their loss. Like most tragedies, this is one that could have been prevented. Like the president's response to Hurricane Maria and other disasters, the federal government's response has been nowhere near up to the challenge. Instead, this administration is now trying to change the narrative by attacking its own citizens at home and weakening the United States abroad. Across the world, our allies in New Zealand, Japan, Australia, South Korea, and many in Europe have taken the science and the threat of COVID-19 seriously. The result is that they are beginning to return to normal. Even countries with very different systems than ours, such as communist Vietnam and Cuba, are beginning to re-emerge from this deadly disease. Secretary Pompeo, the best practices of these countries is simple. Isolate, track and trace, quarantine, and wear a mask. We don't even know if the National Security Advisor has met with you or other members of the National Security Council lately. The U.S. has not done those things sufficiently, and here we are. Secretary Pompeo, you and the White House seem to want to blame China for our inability to respond to this pandemic as well as to our allies. Is it true that they're handling the virus, and it's true that they're handling the virus at the early onset was problematic, but we are responsible for our own response. Do you think the president should look to Europe, South Korea, Japan, and other more successful nations to learn about how to better contain this pandemic?
An awful lot to unpack there, Senator. First, I would tell you that some of the countries that you identified, you're looking at the data that they're putting out, it's worthless. So when you're comparing it to data from other countries, one ought not in a Senate hearing put that data forward as dispositive about the conditions on the ground in those countries. It's silly. I mean, the facts are they're not tracking, they're not counting cases. So we need to make sure we have a shared factual database. Yeah, we should look everywhere to get best practices about how to respond to this. And I know that our doctors, Dr. Perks, who works for me, is now over at the White House working on us, they've done that. And we'll continue to do that to make sure we protect the American people in an appropriate way.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Udall. With that, the committee is going to be at ease, subject to the call of the chair, for approximately 10 minutes.
Yeah, it's